Welcome to our podcast. Today we are certainly glad that you've joined us. We have a presentation we're going to do today that we've entitled The Passport to Heaven. This will be part 2 of this particular series of the prophet Joseph Smith and his experiences in Nauvoo. Today we're going to cover the years of 1841 through 1843. And I might add that this particular podcast will cover a couple of not necessarily controversial items, but certainly items that people have questioned in the past. That'll be the Masonic order as well as polygamy. Both will be discussed today in our podcast. So let's begin. On January 5th, 1842, Joseph opened a general store on Water Street. It became known as the Red Brick Store. I'm sure most of you have seen this picture before. It would become our central gathering point for the saints, and a lot of decisions and instructions and ordinances are going to be given in that particular building. However, you may not be aware of this. This was not Joseph's first Red Brick Store. That was across the street from his home near the temple in Kirtland. He had a mercantile store there as well. Joseph loved to visit with the courageous converts who immigrated from England to Nauvoo and with the established members of the church in the surrounding areas. Nauvoo was kind of like the center hub of a wheel, and the spokes as they went off went to various little communities that were settled by church members. On January the 8th, 1842, Joseph had an interesting visitor. While he was visiting in Plymouth, he was visiting his brother Samuel and his sister Catherine Salisbury. They both lived in Plymouth. And while there, a fellow by the name of Royalty came and visited Joseph. He had invented a machine that he felt would revolutionize warfare for the next 300 years. It was a steam-driven vessel that could throw a cannonball 300 feet and shoot liquid fire. Observation of the enemy was done by an onboard telescope kind of affair, a little bit like a periscope on a submarine. Joseph found the details of this invention quite interesting. However, he felt that the invention ought to be used for something other than the national defense. But nevertheless, it was an interesting conversation, to say the least. Joseph found time for his family and his close friends. On his and Emma's anniversary of January 18th, a large dinner party was held at the Mansion House, and 74 guests were invited. It was a jubilee and commemorated Joseph's marriage to Emma 16 years earlier. Now, in the spring of 1842, Joseph began publishing the translation from the Record of Abraham, which you'll remember he had received and acquired back in 1835. Extracts from the Book of Abraham now appeared in the Times and Seasons and in the British equivalent, the Millennial Star. Now, this is an important date for all the young women in our church. March 17th, 1842, the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo was organized. Emma, of course, was the first president. Elizabeth Ann Whitney and Sarah Cleveland were her counselors. Elvira Cowles, she was treasurer, and Eliza Snow became the secretary. The prophet said, and I quote, "The church was never perfectly organized until the women were organized." By the time of Joseph's death in 1844, the Relief Society had grown to 1,300 women. Well, today, the Relief Society is the largest women's organization in the world, with over 8 million members in 188 different countries. The Relief Society motto, "Charity never faileth," is taken from 1 Corinthians 13:8. Charity never faileth, but whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. And now abideth faith, hope, charity. These three, but the greatest of these is charity. In March of 1842, another important institution was established, Freemasonry. Many church leaders were Masons prior to joining the church. Freemasonry is an international society that preaches brotherliness, charity, and mutual aid. And this is a good union for the church at this time. It was in harmony with the teachings of Joseph. And on March 15th, 1842, the Grand Master, Abraham Jonas of Columbus, granted authority for Nauvoo to have its own Masonic lodge. It would be called the Rising Sun Lodge of the Ancient York Masons, and it would soon become the largest in the state. Lucius Scoville, that's the Scoville Bakery next door, donated the land for the building of the Masonic Hall. Its building would be dedicated in April of 1844 with over 550 members in attendance. Eventually, it would grow to over 1,500 members, and as I mentioned, would become the largest Masonic Hall in the state of Illinois. That very same day, Joseph received the first degree in Freemasonry, and the next day he was made a third-degree Mason, the highest level in New York Rite. This effort would link Joseph and the church to many influential individuals who could help the cause of the church. Now, in explaining the church's involvement in Freemasonry, we really don't have to look any farther than Joseph simply asking, "What is this all about?" It is evident that the Masonic ritual embraces a few features that resemble the rudimentary ceremonies of the temple endowment, yet these few points of similarity are largely restricted to the rituals pertaining to the Aaronic priesthood. The inspired rituals of the Melchizedek priesthood are entirely unknown. In point of fact, actually, the temple endowment transcends the Masonic ritual to the point that they really are more unalike than alike. Heber C. Kimball recorded that after Joseph became a Mason, he explained to the brethren that Masonry had its origin with the priesthood. Franklin D. Richards, who became an apostle in 1849, stated, quote, "Joseph the prophet was aware that there were some things about Masonry that had come down from the beginning, and he desired to know what they were, hence the lodge." Now, I want to make this point very, very clear that Masonry did not initiate the temple endowment. From June of 1830 to February of 1831, Joseph was translating the Bible. During this time, he received a revelation called the Book of Moses, and to a great extent, it contains portions of the complete temple endowment. The phrase temple appears 191 times in the Bible. Malachi speaks of, quote, "the Lord coming quickly to the people and turning the hearts of the children to their fathers." In Corinthians, we learn of baptisms for the dead. 1 Peter teaches of spirits in prison. Nehemiah speaks of a recorded genealogy in the temple. In fact, the first 3 chapters of Genesis relate the creation story. And God says in Genesis, "This is a token of the covenant I have made between you and me." Exodus tells of Aaron being washed and anointed prior to having the holy garments placed upon him. Numbers talks about the laying on of hands. Isaiah and Revelations both talk about a new name. Revelations also tells us that we are to become kings and priests, as well as not defiling our garments. Well, after the Savior's appearance in the Kirtland Temple on March 27, 1836, a partial endowment was administered with washings and anointings. On January 18, 1842, 3 months prior to Masonry being established in Nauvoo, Joseph was given a revelation to build a temple. In it he was told, and this is found in Doctrine and Covenants, section 124, "And verily I say unto you, let this house be built unto my name, that I may reveal mine ordinances therein unto my people. For I design to reveal unto my church things which have been kept hid from before the foundations of the world, things that pertain to the dispensation of the fullness of times. And I will show unto my servant Joseph all things pertaining to this house, and the priesthood thereof, and the place whereon it shall be built." Well, in 1844, the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge was actually severed from the Illinois Grand Lodge for alleged improprieties and because of jealous anti-Mormon Masonic members from the surrounding lodges. Masonry was discontinued once the saints left for the Rocky Mountains. On April the 16th, the Wasp, that's a weekly newspaper, was published, and Joseph's younger, somewhat more aggressive brother, William Smith, was its editor. This paper had political overtones of sorts that were used to rebuff the accusations made by Thomas Sharp in his newspaper called the Warsaw Signal. In late April, Joseph was inspired to introduce the first temple ordinances. On April 28, 1842, at a meeting of the newly organized Female Relief Society, Joseph spoke of delivering the keys of the priesthood to the church, and faithful sisters should receive them in connection with their husbands. This is the first reference to the administration of the sacred temple ordinances. On May 4, 1842, the first temple endowment and introduction to the concept of eternal marriage was given to a few select people by the prophet. The first 9 men were endowed in the upper room of Joseph's red brick store, and they were Hiram Smith, William Law, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, Willard Richards, William Marks, Newell K. Whitney, George Miller, and Judge James Adams. Brigham Young wrote of receiving his washings, anointings, and endowment. This was a grand and glorious opportunity for these brethren. Others would follow. Unfortunately, some would never appreciate the significance of the experience and will someday have to answer for their disobedience. On May 6th, ex-Governor Lalbrum Boggs was shot while at home in Independence, Missouri. Although severely injured, he was not killed. Joseph and Orrin Porter Rockwell would be accused in this assassination attempt. There was also mischief afoot on the battlegrounds. On May 7th, the Nauvoo Legion fought a sham battle outside of Nauvoo in which John C. Bennett, remember we talked extensively about him in our last podcast, John C. Bennett conspired to have the prophet killed during this sham battle. Well, the still soft whisperings of the Spirit saved Joseph's life. John C. Bennett's true colors were showing. Joseph had suspected him and others in a conspiracy, and now the evidence was beginning to come forth. John C. Bennett joined the church 18 months earlier with the professed desire and love for the gospel, when in reality he never believed in the restored church. After his botched attempt on Joseph's life, and because of numerous rumors circulating about his moral conduct, John C. Bennett's time in the sun was gone. On May 19th, Joseph was elected mayor of Nauvoo, replacing John C. Bennett. And in June of 1842, John C. Bennett was excommunicated for immoral conduct. In fact, on the eve of Bennett marrying a Nauvoo woman, it was found out that he already had a wife and children that he had deserted in the east. Well, he left Nauvoo shortly thereafter and set about to destroy the prophet Joseph Smith. Others of this clandestine group would also soon be cut off from the church. Namely, the lawyer Chauncey Higbee was excommunicated from the church for unchaste conduct involving 4 young girls caught up in his deceit and misrepresentation. His involvement with the conspirators would soon be known to all. The purging process had begun again. Joseph was continually trying to perfect the saints. Many times this would involve purging those who had evil hearts. On July 20th, 1842, Lalbrum Boggs swore in an affidavit that Orrin Porter Rockwell had tried to kill him and that Joseph Smith was an accessory before the fact. Orrin made the statement, "I could not have been involved, for if I was, he would be dead." Very true. On August the 6th, while in Montrose, Iowa, at the installation of the officers of the Rising Sun Lodge of the ancient York Masons, Joseph made a very remarkable prophecy. He said, and I quote, "The saints would be driven to the Rocky Mountains, where they would become a mighty people." Interestingly enough, he did not include himself in the fulfillment of that particular prophecy. On August the 8th, the prophet and Orrin Porter Rockwell were taken into custody for the attempted assassination of ex-Governor Boggs. Joseph filed a writ of habeas corpus to be tried in Nauvoo. The arresting sheriff from the governor's office was afraid to obey or disobey the order. He rushed away to consult with Governor Carlin of Illinois, who was in league with Governor Thomas Reynolds of Missouri. When he returned to rearrest the prisoners, they had escaped. They had fled to the islands in the middle of the Mississippi. And over the next 3 months, Joseph would hide in a variety of homes, as well as the islands of Kimball and Gayland, to escape these illegal warrants. While in hiding, Joseph wrote a number of important addresses to the saints on the subject of baptism for the dead. The prophet had the time to contemplate his true friends. On August 23, 1842, the prophet decided to record their names in his book he entitled The Book of the Law of the Lord. A few of the names that he recorded and wrote brief comments about were Joseph Knight Sr., Newell Knight, Joseph Knight Jr., and Orrin Porter Rockwell, about whom he said, quote, "My soul loves him." He also included Joseph Smith Sr., Lucy Mack Smith, Alvin Smith, Don Carlos Smith, and his older brother Hiram. On December 26th, after nearly 3 months of hiding, Joseph submitted himself to be arrested when the Supreme Court of Illinois ruled that the writ he had filed in Nauvoo was illegal. So on January 2nd, 1843, as Joseph awaited trial, he prophesied that he would never be taken to Missouri, dead or alive. Well, at the trial on January 4th, Joseph was proven innocent for the third time and acquitted for being an accessory to the shooting of Governor Boggs. Joseph could now finally enjoy a brief moment of peace. He spent some quiet time during the month of February studying the German language. He had always said that the German version of the King James edition of the Bible was the most accurate. Joseph found time for his family and close friends. On February the 8th, he spent the day sliding on the ice on the Mississippi with his son Frederick, who was 6 years old. Joseph continued to have close contact with the heavens. On February the 9th, Joseph received an interesting revelation found in Doctrine and Covenants, section 129, which stated the way in which angels, just men made perfect, and evil spirits could be discerned. On Saturday, March the 4th, Orrin Porter Rockwell was apprehended in St. Louis by the Missourians for the attempted murder of Boggs. It would be 10 months before Joseph would see his good friend again. However, on March the 15th, Joseph prophesied Orrin Porter Rockwell would get away honorably from the Missourians. On April 2nd, while visiting the outlying community of Ramus, Joseph Smith received a revelation found in Doctrine and Covenants, section 130. He stated many great truths in this prophecy, such as, quote, "The Father has a body of flesh and bone as tangible as man's. The more knowledge and intelligence a person could gain in this life, he would have so much more the advantage in the world to come. And when we obtain any blessing from God, it is by obedience to that law upon which it is predicated." Joseph would give over 200 such sermons that would shape the saints' understanding of the gospel doctrines and immeasurably influence the future of the church. Of interest to Joseph Smith, the amateur archaeologist, was the discovery on Sunday, April 23rd in 1843, of 6 brass plates and a supposed large skeleton found by a Mr. R. Wiley near Kinderhook, Pike County, Illinois. Joseph hoped that this would validate the existence of ancient plates like those of the Book of Mormon. Well, anti-Mormons hoped to trick Joseph into translating these hoaxed plates. However, Joseph never did step into the trap that they had set. In May, the newspaper The Wasp took on a new and more friendlier name. It was now called the Nauvoo Neighbor. Its editor now would be John Taylor, about whom Joseph said, and I quote, "John's only sin in life was that he could not spell." Well, the first edition was circulated on May 3rd, 1843. In mid-May, Joseph traveled to Ramus, Illinois, for another conference. On his way home, he stopped in Carthage and had dinner with Judge Stephen A. Douglas. And while there, Joseph prophesied that, quote, "Judge Douglas would aspire to the presidency of the United States, but if he ever turned against the saints, he would feel the hand of the Almighty." Well, history tells us that Judge Douglas did run for the presidency, and unfortunately, under pressure, he did turn against the Saints in the Utah War. He was beaten badly at the election polls, even though he was the favored candidate. The winner was Abraham Lincoln. Douglas died 6 weeks after his defeat. On May 26, Joseph re-administered the temple endowment to the same individuals he had a year earlier, giving them further light and knowledge. This time he included Emma, his wife, and on September 28, 1843, Emma would become the first female to receive the temple endowment. On June 8, 1843, a good friend of Joseph died, Elias Higbee. He was an avid supporter of the cause of the saints. He accompanied the prophet to Washington, D.C., and showed great courage as he stood before the Senate and virtually argued the cause of the saints by himself. In Joseph's book that I've alluded to, The Law of the Lord, Joseph wrote about Elias Higbee. He said, "His course is approved." Unfortunately, that would not be the case for Elias Higbee's sons. It seems at this point the Higbee's brothers started to turn on Joseph. Francis and Chauncey Higbee were men of importance in the community. Chauncey was a lawyer and Francis was a justice of the peace. However, Chauncey had been excommunicated from the church in May of 1842 for unchastity. Francis was also an adulterer. However, his excommunication was not formalized until May of 1844. Again, these are all people that are part of this clandestine belly of deceit within Nauvoo. On May 13th, Joseph and Emma left Nauvoo to go and visit Emma's sister. She lived in Dixon, which is Lee County, Illinois. Joseph H. Reynolds, a sheriff from Jackson County, Missouri, and Constable Harmon T. Wilson of Carthage, Illinois, were given a writ signed by Governor Reynolds of Missouri and Governor Ford of Illinois, and told to go and arrest Joseph. This was done at the urging, of course, of John C. Bennett, who had now joined the Missouri force trying to capture Joseph. Now, this slide kind of puts it in perspective, starting with Boggs and ending with Ford. First Boggs, second Boggs and Carlin, third Reynolds and Carlin, and fourth Reynolds and Ford. As these various governors came into position, they all had this desire to arrest Joseph and bring him to justice, quote unquote, back in Missouri. Well, Judge James Adams discovered the plan while in an unrelated conversation with Governor Ford. He sent a warning to Joseph, and since Joseph was en route to Dixon, William Clayton and Stephen Markham rode 212 miles in 64 hours to warn Joseph of an impending danger. Joseph was grateful for their concern, but felt that he would be safe, and he refused to leave. Well, the arresting officers from Missouri disguised themselves as Mormon missionaries and were successful in kidnapping Joseph in Dixon. Joseph was then imprisoned overnight in a local tavern and denied legal help. Well, the neighborhood was aroused, and they detained the arresting sheriffs. Brother Markham obtained a writ for the arrest of the two sheriffs for kidnapping and threatening the life of Joseph. Well, the two sheriffs were arrested by Sheriff Campbell of Lee County. Meanwhile, Brother Clayton returned to Nauvoo and with Hiram's help called out the Nauvoo Legion. 80 men were sent upriver on the Maid of Iowa, and 170 men rode out on horseback to ensure that Joseph was not taken to Missouri. Well, Sheriff Campbell was convinced by Joseph that the court of jurisdiction for this particular case would be in Nauvoo. This group consisted of 2 sheriffs in the custody of another sheriff, and Joseph in the custody of 2 sheriffs under arrest. This made an interesting and even amusing sight as they were met by the Nauvoo Legion en route back to Nauvoo. Well, the municipal court at Nauvoo discharged Joseph on the grounds that the writ against him was illegal, and Governor Ford apparently then upheld that decision. The summer of 1843 was busy for the prophet. Authority had been given the saints in March of 1842 for the construction of their own Masonic Hall in Nauvoo, the cornerstone being laid on June 24, 1843. Well, the prophet was accustomed to receiving many important and famous guests at his home. On July the 2nd, Joseph conducted interviews and was entertained by several Potawatomi Indian chiefs who heralded him as their chief. All right, let's turn the page, and now let's conclude our podcast today with a discussion about Joseph's greatest hour. Again, this falls in our 1841 to 1843 time era, a discussion on polygamy. I want to begin by defining the word foreordination. In the premortal spirit world, God appointed certain spirits to fulfill specific missions during their mortal lives. This is called foreordination. Foreordination does not guarantee that individuals will receive certain callings or responsibilities. Such opportunities come in this life as a result of the righteous exercise of agency. Foreordination came as a result of righteousness in the premortal existence. The doctrine of foreordination applies to all members of the church, not just the Savior and his prophets. Before the creation of the earth, faithful women were given certain responsibilities, and faithful men were foreordained to certain priesthood duties. As people prove themselves worthy, they will be given opportunities to fulfill the assignments that they would have received. Well, the date of July 12th, 1843 will be recorded in, I believe, the heavenly record on high as Joseph's greatest test of his noble foreordination. The revelation on celestial marriage, Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, was dictated by Joseph and written down in the presence of Hiram Smith by William Clayton. This is the preface to 132, the header. Revelation given through Joseph Smith the prophet in Nauvoo, Illinois, recorded on July 12, 1843, relating to the new and everlasting covenant, including the eternity of the marriage covenant and the principle of plural marriage. Although the revelation was recorded in 1843, evidence indicates that some of the principles involved in this revelation were known by the prophet as early as 1831. Well, this revelation had been alluded to on a number of occasions, but really never written down in its entirety. Hiram urged Joseph to write the revelation by way of the Urim and Thummim. But Joseph replied, and I quote, "I do not need to do that. I know the revelation perfectly from beginning to end." This principle had been weighing on Joseph's mind for many, many years. It was explained in part to him in February, clear back in 1831. Joseph became concerned with passages of Scripture in Genesis while translating the Old Testament. These referred to the many wives of the ancient prophets, prophets like Abraham, Esau, Jacob, Moses, and David. He inquired of the Lord why these men were blessed, when by the standards of Joseph's day they would be under condemnation. And he was told the purpose was to, and this is purpose number 1 in our discussion on polygamy, to raise up a righteous seed unto me. Joseph was told more than once that if you ask and you are told, you need to obey. Joseph asked and attempted to obey. In an effort to restore all ancient biblical doctrines and practices, there's some evidence to suggest that Joseph entered into a polygamous relationship briefly in February of 1833, back in the Kirtland era. This effort by Joseph to practice what he had come to know from the Lord was an absolute disaster. Joseph did not have at this time the knowledge or understanding or the principles involved in this particular doctrine. However, we do understand that purpose number 1 was to rise up a righteous seed. Richard Van Wagner observed, and I quote, "The difficulties of practicing polygamy in the 1833-1835 era seriously hampered Joseph's apparent enthusiasm for plural marriage," as I'm sure that's true. The next evidence of plural wives surfaces as a polyandrous relationship in Far West in 1838. This is a paper marriage, with the woman remaining and living with her original husband. Well, nothing further is known until the Nauvoo era is established. In fact, during the spring of 1842, Joseph is visited by an angel with a drawn sword, who told him it was time to obey the commandment or perish. It was now time to separate the wheat from the tares. There are 20 different reminiscences that I'm aware of from such notables as Lorenzo Snow, Benjamin Johnson, Orson Pratt, and Brigham Young that recount Joseph's encounter with this sword-bearing angel who commanded him to establish the practice of plural marriage or be slain. Helen Mar Kimball Whitney stated, and I quote, "Had it not been for the fear of the Lord's displeasure, Joseph would have shrunk from the undertaking and would have continued silent as he had done for many years. Joseph put off this dreaded day as long as he dared." Lucy Walker reported, quote, "Joseph had his doubts about it, for he debated it in his own mind for years." Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner recalled, quote, "Joseph told me he was afraid when the angel appeared to him twice and told him to take other wives. He hesitated, and the angel appeared to him a third time with a drawn sword in his hand and threatened his life if he did not fulfill the commandment." Erastus Snow said, and I quote, "Joseph had to plead on his knees before the angel for his life." No other episode in Joseph's personal history records a near-death, life-threatening incident with the Lord. Joseph's foot-dragging provoked the heavens as never before. At one point in 1843, Joseph lamented to Levi Hancock, quote, "Brother Levi, if I should make known to my brethren what God has made known to me, they would seek to take my life." Also in 1843, Joseph observed, quote, "Men will say I will never forsake you, but will stand by you at all times. But the moment you teach them some of the mysteries of God that are retained in heavens and are to be revealed to the children of men when they are prepared, they will be the first to put a stone to you." Joseph knew that this principle would eventually cost him his life. Joseph said, and I quote, "God commanded me to obey the law, and unless I accepted it and introduced it and practiced it, I together with my people should be damned and cut off from this time henceforth." However, by this time Joseph had a much greater knowledge and a greater grasp on eternal principles and the gospel plan. Liberty Jail had aided in that process. Joseph had been primed and prepared, his tutor being none other than the Lord. In Liberty Jail he was told, and I quote, "My son, peace be unto thy soul. Thine adversity and thine affliction shall be but a small moment. And then, if thou endure it well, God shall exalt thee on high. Thou art called to pass through tribulation, that these things may give thee experience, and shall be for thy good." Well, Joseph knew that this principle was necessary, and a great deal of good would eventually come out of it. He also knew, like Zion's camp, this test would determine once and for all the most righteous and valiant saints. And so purpose number 2 for polygamy was a separation of the wheat from the tares. The church would eventually grow because of plural marriage, despite the opposition against it. Now, this is really important for you to understand, that at the time of the death of Joseph and Hiram, there were 9 significant splinter groups. 9 significant splinter groups. Groups such as the Cutlerites, Strangeites, Bickertonites, Whiteites, Rigdonites, Hedrikites, Josephites, and others. And these groups drew many, many saints away from the body of the church. However, the nucleus of the 12 apostles, those linked in marriage through polygamy, stayed together, never wavering. The marriages that would take place in Nauvoo would cement and link the most righteous leadership families together, creating a safety net that would ensure the survival of the church and establish a foundation for its rebirth in the Utah Basin in 1847. It also did as the Lord had said, separated the wheat from the tares, and raised a righteous seed. I might add, in my research, as I've explored these splinter groups who did not practice polygamy, today, for all intents and purposes, they're non-existent. The group that did practice polygamy 17 million members of the church today. Purpose number 3, to cement, link, and provide a safety net. There are 33 well-documented plural marriages to Joseph, most of them polyandrous. Once instituted in the church, there was never more than 2 to 3% of the righteous priesthood holders who practiced it. Brigham Young, who sometimes gets kind of a bad rap for this subject, had a difficult time accepting the concept of plural marriage. He said, and I quote, "I was not desirous of shrinking from my duty, nor failing in the least to do as I was commanded. But it was the first time in my life that I had desired the grave, and I could hardly get over it for a long time. And when I saw a funeral, I felt to envy the corpse in its situation, and to regret that I was not in the coffin." After this revelation was formally written down, Joseph asked Hiram to present it to Emma, hoping her feelings perhaps had been tempered somewhat over the last 10 years. In returning from the task, Hiram said, and I quote, "I have never received a more severe talking to in my life. Emma is very bitter and full of resentment and anger." However, Eliza Arsenault, a plural wife of the prophet, and others testify that Emma Smith gave consent to at least 4 of Joseph's wives and taught them the doctrine, encouraged them to accept it. Well, despite Emma's personal feelings, this was to be Joseph's greatest challenge and perhaps his greatest hour. President Wilford Woodruff received a revelation 47 years later in September of 1890. 47 years later, I want to emphasize that point, showed him what would happen to the church in the future if they continued to practice plural marriage. And after this vision that President Woodruff had, it was determined that for the temporal salvation of the church, plural marriage would cease. The manifesto was issued on October 6, 1890, and the church submitted to the laws of the land. My question to you is, perhaps we should have asked earlier than 47 years later. Perhaps today we wouldn't have the confusion with the fundamentalist church and others that still attempt to try and practice polygamy. Joseph accomplished what he was asked to do, and because of that, the prophet Joseph Smith will be exalted. I hope you've enjoyed our podcast today as we've talked about a number of important things from 1841 to 1843. I look forward to you joining me next time as we continue our Passport to Heaven series, and we'll be discussing the years of 1844. Thank you for joining me. Look forward to seeing you next time.